Okay, so let's get a couple of things straight here. This video is not my top 10 books of all time, although naturally the novels here are among some of my favourite books out there. And it is not the 10 books that I think everybody should read in their lifetime, because that would probably just be a long list of non-fiction more than anything else. These 10 books are specifically the books that I feel and have noticed in my life that I recommend time and time again. These are the books that if I get asked for specific recommendations online, I seem to naturally gravitate towards, and these are the books that if I'm friends with or just even like vaguely know you in real life, I've probably brought up or mentioned to you in the past. Maybe not every single one of them, but certainly at least few. And I know with absolute certainty that all of the books on this list I have influenced multiple people to read, because I just keep recommending them. So I thought I would just film this video, get it all off my chest, and tell you about the 10 books that I recommend to literally everybody. You might not be interested in them all, but I'd give at least one or two of them a shot because they're brilliant books and I can't stop recommending them. Side note, I have decided to stick with novels in this particular video, but if you'd like to see something similar for non-fiction, then let me know. So these books are literally in no particular order. I'm just going to read them to you as I've written them down, and I'm probably going to jump around a lot in terms of genre, so I hope you're into a little bit of everything. First up on my list though is A Night to Surrender by Tessa Dare. Now, this is not my favourite book by Tessa Dare. I really enjoyed it. It was one of the books that very much cemented Tessa Dare as an author of interest to me, that got me into her books and that I enjoyed reading, but it's not my favourite. The reason that I recommend it over most anything else, there's like one other book I probably recommend equally as often, but I thought I'd stick with this in this video, is because it's the first in a series, and I particularly like to recommend this series, which is the Spindle Cove series, because I think it goes against people's expectations of historical romance, and these are expectations that are usually based on not really having read historical Regency romance, or perhaps having read a few and them maybe like not quite aligning with Tessa Dare's very like specific humour and approach to this genre. But Tessa Dare was very much the author that got me interested in romance in general, and I think it's because of her books that I have always had a very special place in my heart for Regency romance novels. So when anybody tells me that they're not into historical romance, but they're coming at that from the perspective of not having read any and just having like assumed that they wouldn't like it, which is totally fair. Like, there's definitely genres I've just assumed I'm not going to be into, so I haven't bothered to try. I do tend to go, but have you tried this Tessa Dare? Like, you should try Tessa Dare. You should check out Tessa Dare and then make that choice, because that was very much me before Tessa Dare. Like, I didn't think I liked romance in general. I thought I liked a little side romance in my fantasy, but I did not think I was a romance genre reader. And what I enjoy about the Spindle Cove series in particular is that it does take a feminist approach to this time period in this genre. Yes, there's going to be a little bit of creative licensing in that regard, but it's sort of like, it like colours within the lines whilst like bleeding a little bit outwards, but in a way that like you can believe there was like a niche section of society doing. You know, there was always outliers regardless of what were the norms and the social standards and the expectations of the day. And I feel like Tessa Dare is kind of like playing with that, because Spindle Cove is a seaside community where basically women who are not the norm go, and they might be not the norm because they're wallflowers and they don't like to dance at balls, or they might be intellectuals who are more interested in becoming academics than getting married. They may have had a scandal surrounding them that has made them have to flee like the upper crust society, what have you. And Spindle Cove as a place gives them a space to be themselves and explore who they are and be safe and free in a way that they aren't always able to. And in particular in book 1 in the series, we actually follow the woman who is responsible for Spindle Cove even existing. She's grown up in the seaside town helping her father, but being beaten down for being a woman. It's such such a wonderful series. So yeah, A Night to Surrender is the first book on this list. Side note, if you have ever actually read any of the books I mentioned in this video because I recommended them, please let me know. I'd love to know what you thought of them. Hopefully you enjoyed them, but honestly I'm happy to chat about them even if you didn't. So yeah, have my constant recommendations made a difference? Book number 2, however, on this list is my comfort book. It is the book that I pretty much hold above all other books as the only book I would read if I could only read one book forever, and that is Going Postal by Terry Pratchett. So I recommend Terry Pratchett all the time. I also get a lot of requests and questions about where to start with Terry Pratchett because people know I'm really into him. I have been since I was like 10 or 11 years old and my dad introduced me to his work. He is one of my favourite authors of all time, but Going Postal in particular, just, it holds that special place, and it actually comes completely in the midst of a series if you think of Discworld as one continuous series. However, I think it's easier to think of the Discworld books, of which there are 41 in total, as more of a world in which there are multiple series set. So within the Discworld you get books that work as standalones, you get books that are the beginning of series. You can pretty much jump in and start wherever you want, but then there are some books that, like, maybe if you read the book about those characters that came before, it might be a little bit easier to follow. I've never taken that approach, I've just read them as I have wanted, but it might depend on like how you prefer to read. And Going Postal I think is one that not only do I like love with my whole heart, but works as like an entry point because it is the beginning of a new character's story. So this book is set in Ankh-Morpork, which is the capital of Terry Pratchett's Discworld, and the story follows Moist von Lipwig, who is a conman, or ex-conman perhaps, during this novel, or at least that's like the hope for his future. And he has never been introduced to Discworld prior to this. This is like Moist's debut, his entry into society, and he enters in with a bang at his execution. He is sentenced to be hung, and he is in fact hung to within an inch of his life. But he does not die, and instead he is given an opportunity to reform by restoring the post office to its greatness. It is not quite as simple a task as it might seem though, because there are some who are very invested in the post office not being restored, and on top of this, Moist is only kind of half-heartedly trying. Like, he takes this opportunity in the hopes that he will actually be able to like run away and become a con man again. So that is like the setup of this book, and it is just perfect. It is hilarious, it is heartwarming, it is very, very clever, like all of Terry Pratchett's books, and for me it is just like top tier Terry Pratchett and top tier book. From fantasy to sci-fi, the next book on this list is one of the first books that actually made me realise I like space. Like, I don't care to go to space, nothing like that, but I'm actually into sci-fi books set in space, and up until this point I did not think I was. Like, I didn't think I was like a high sci-fi girl. This is a little bit like my experience with Tessa Dare in that I kind of thought that genre wasn't for me. I was wrong. Enter Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. Generally speaking, Nnedi Okorafor is another author who I do just recommend time and time again. I've loved every book I've read by her, and she writes quite a like diverse range of things. She's got fantasy, she's got sci-fi, she's got comic books as well as novels, and they've all been brilliant. Binti though will just forever be like that book for me. It is perfect. The whole series is perfect. It's about a young woman who has been accepted to this prestigious like intergalactic outer space university, but nobody from her community on her planet has ever left the planet. They have never left the planet behind. Other humans have, but none of her people ever have, and it's something that she knows her parents and her family will be very against, and she wants to honour them and their culture, but also like explore this part of herself and explore what's out there and what this university and education could offer her. That's like the premise, but then book one just takes these twists and turns that you do not see coming. Like, the whole book is just one big what? Was not that's not where I thought the book was going. It's brilliant and it's fantastic, and it does all of that in like less than 90 pages, I'm sure. This is a novella, but I love this book. It is so compelling, and I've had so many people in my real life read it and fall in love with it because I recommended it, so I'm very proud of that. The next book, however, proves that Binti was not a fluke and that I do indeed love my high sci-fi outer space novels, and that is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. Now, this is actually a book that was recommended to me a bunch of times by a bunch of friends who themselves felt compelled to continuously recommend it. It just has that effect on people, I think. Like, if you love it, you love it. If it's not for you, it's not for you, but like if you enjoy it, it seems to be one of those books that you are just head over heels with. This one is certainly longer than Binti. It's a much more like full-length novel than a novella, and it can very much work as a standalone. There are further books in the series, but each book follows different characters in the same universe. So the first book works as a standalone, and it follows the crew of this spaceship. It's a working ship, and they're all from very different backgrounds, and we start off our journey with the like new character, with the like new woman that joins their spaceship because she's trying to get away from the life that she'd been leading thus far, and a scandal that's surrounding her family. So we kind of go with her to be introduced to all these new characters and their dynamics and see how she fits in, but we also get to see the story from their perspective as we learn more about them, and I just adored it. Like, it's not a very plot heavy book. The point is the journey. It's not about like where you're going, it's about the characters and getting to know them and their dynamics and learning about the world, this amazing in-depth world that Becky Chambers has created. It's that kind of immersive book where it's about where you are in setting and in place and in like community, rather than about being like this big dramatic storyline plot, which there is something like moving the story forward at all times, but like it's not the crux of the book. And if you like Firefly, you need to read this book, because that's exactly what it is. It's everything that Firefly was and could have been, and I love it, and I just keep recommending it. The recommendation was passed to me, and then I have continued to pass it forward. Next up, we have a contemporary novel which is actually very loosely inspired by Greek and Roman myth. Now, this is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. Now, I don't think it really matters that it's inspired by Greek or Roman myth in a loose fashion, because I didn't know that when I read it. This is something I learned after the fact, and it's fun to learn after the fact because it kind of explains certain choices that the author made and adds like a whole new layer of intertextuality, but the book itself stands alone without that. So for the sake of clarity, since I have hinted at it now, there is elements of the Daphne and Apollo myth within this story, but like I mentioned, it very much stands free of that as well. It is a novel set in South Korea following a woman who decides to become a vegetarian. But it's not really about like vegetarianism, which is funny because I think that's the reason I picked it up. I saw it in the Edinburgh Book Festival bookshop tent on a display of translated works and thought, The Vegetarian, I'm one of those, what's this about? Picked it up and took it home. And it's not about that. It's about body autonomy, and it's about like women having choice and freedom, and the way in which the different men in their life control their existence and their body in different ways and also take advantage of them. And for that reason, it's actually never told from the perspective of the main character, except in some vignettes in the final part. It's a 3-part book where the first part is told from the perspective of this woman's husband, who treats her like a maid, who like has no real like feeling or like emotion towards her. She is like a worker in his house. And then the second part is told from the perspective of her brother-in-law, who in contrast with that fetishizes and sexualizes her to an extreme. And then in part 3 we actually follow the story from her sister's perspective. It is a beautifully written, beautifully told, clever, thought-provoking and like harrowing novel that I just can't stop telling everybody about and haven't been able to since I first read it. On the topic of Greek and Roman myth, however, I am of course an ancient historian, and I'm sure you're wondering why there hasn't been an ancient book on this list yet, but do not worry, there is one. Just one, because I feel like as much as I love ancient literature, there's not a ton of ancient books I just like willy-nilly recommend at random to people for no reason, unless they're like, I want a book that tells a specific myth, or I want an entry point into Greek mythology, or an entry point into Greek philosophy or politics or what have you. There is one book, however, that I do just recommend to everybody, that like I genuinely think everybody can enjoy, no matter how much of an interest they actually have in ancient Greek and Roman history, and that is of course Staffness and Chloe by Longus. This book for me is a multitude of things. It is, for starters, an example, a perfect example of how accessible ancient literature can be and how it doesn't have to be like highbrow and intimidating and inaccessible, and that it is in fact for everybody, because this is part of what would have been like a popular genre in antiquity, like the average people would have read and enjoyed. Specifically one of the ancient Greek romances, which are a subgenre of ancient literature which began in the Hellenistic era and like flourished during the Roman Empire. And I actually think I have a whole video on the topic from so many years ago back, but I'm sure like the information still holds, even if I'm embarrassed by like how young and awkward I am in it. Not only that, however, but it is just like a really compelling little book, and it does a lot of clever things. So it can be read just like as an enjoyable story about two young people who've been raised on this island and have started to experience like puberty and sexual interest in one another, but like don't know what to do with these feelings. But it can also be taken apart and analysed and considered for all of the value it has as a historical piece of literature, and all of the intertextuality and the way that it interacts with the other books that fall within this genre. It is actually very clever, and it turns a lot of the tropes of this genre on its head. But I don't think you need to know the tropes of this genre or to have read anything else in this genre to still enjoy it. It can be enjoyed in two ways in that respect. So yeah, I love this book. It's very short, and I think it's a great place to jump in with ancient literature if you have been feeling intimidated by it. Next up on my list is one of my favourite horror novels of all time, and that is Ring Shout by P. Shelley Clark. This is like alternative history, paranormal sci-fi horror, and it is so creative and so compelling and so well done, and it crawls underneath your skin, and it also makes commentary on society. Like, that's what I want from a horror, right? I want something that makes me feel very unnerved and like on edge whilst I'm reading it, and like super creeped out, or whatever that feeling is that you seem to crave when you read or watch horror. It also makes me think. Like, I think that is the best kind of horror. The best kind of horror is rooted in the real horrors of history and modern life. So this book in particular is set in the early 1900s when the film adaptation of Birth of a Nation was released in cinemas. And from the very offset, it has these like vague paranormal, sci-fi, supernatural elements to it. Like, they're like hinted at, they're part of the society that the main character is a part of. But the main way this manifests in the story is through a representation of the KKK, who are in part supernatural, like not all members, but one of the ways that they like spread their hatred is through media like Birth of a Nation. And aside from the supernatural, paranormal, science fiction elements, whatever you want to call them, I don't know which one exactly fits best, it isn't actually really that much of an alternative history, but it is so well written. I do think that P. Shelley Clark in general does alternate history, supernatural storylines super well. He also does it in his Dead Gin in Cairo books, so it's not something that is new for him. But I think this book in particular really like demonstrates his writing and world building capabilities, and it is just like phenomenal. That one is in fact another novella, which actually is part of the Tor novella series like Binti, so like big fan of that series, also recommend that series a lot. But if you want a longer novel, I'm going to recommend the book you've all been waiting for if you've been watching my channel for a few years now, and that is Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. Yes, she's on this list. I'm sure you would have been shocked if she wasn't, if you are familiar with my content, because since the day I read this book, since the day I finished this book, I have been harping on about it. Like, I don't think you can have watched more than 10 of my videos and not heard about this book. I don't think you can have met me in real life and not have heard about this book. It is historical fantasy set in medieval Ireland, and it follows a young woman named Sorcha who begins the story as a child. And it's the story about her strength and her perseverance and her dedication and her just like, I don't know, incredibleness. I love her so much. How else do I phrase it? In the early parts of the novel, her father remarries, and the woman he remarries is evidently a sorceress who eventually puts a curse on her 6 brothers to turn them into swans, and she is given a task by the fair folk to save them, essentially, which involves her not being able to utter a single word. Like, she cannot speak while she undertakes this task, which is a very like physically tolling act of sewing with very brittle, painful materials, and it is hard and it lasts years, and a lot happens whilst she is doing this task, and it is so beautiful and atmospheric and heartbreaking and powerful and also heartwarming. Like, wonderful and terrible things happen throughout this book, and for me it's both the world building and setting, the very like vivid detailed picture of medieval Ireland that Juliet Marillier paints, and Sorcha as a protagonist that makes this book so compelling. She is just somebody that you have to root for and that you become so invested in, and despite this book being slow and winding, I couldn't put it down. I read this compulsively over the space of 48 hours, and the night's sleep I got in between was filled with anxiety dreams over Sorcha's fate. So it had me from the get-go, and I have since become a die-hard fan of Juliet Marillier. I adore everything that she has written that I have read, which is quite a lot at this point, and I have recommended her time and time and time and time again, so here's once more for good measure. For a like softer, lighter fantasy novel that is also part romance, like it is a fantasy romance novel, another book that I continually come back to when I'm recommending books to other people is Radiance by Grace Draven. This is another author that I adore. She specialises in fantasy romance and she does it so well, but Radiance just like stands above everything else for me. In fact, I think it's my favourite romantic plotline in any book I've ever read, because it doesn't necessarily follow the same structure you might be familiar with traditional romance novels. Like, you come to expect certain things from a romance novel, which include a lot of like falling out and lies and miscommunication, but that's not what this book is. This book is about two people, one who is a human, one who is not, who are part of an arranged marriage to unite their kingdoms. But rather than either A, love at first sight, or B, hatred at first sight, which you'll find in a lot of this kind of trope in romance, this book is about two people who genuinely want to work to have a successful relationship, even if that's a platonic relationship from the get-go. Their marriage doesn't require that they have any children. They're not the heirs to their thrones. It is about like creating this bond between their families, and they are just both hoping to meet somebody who's willing to build a productive, happy life with them, and they are both pleasantly surprised when this is what they discover. They have very different experiences and backgrounds, not only coming from different kingdoms but from different like races in this magical fantasy world, and they're both willing to like compromise and negotiate those differences, and slowly but surely that relationship becomes a romantic one, and it is so beautiful to see unfold. It is such a comforting, heartwarming book. Like, it is probably my second comfort book after Going Postal. Like, if I need comfort, this book is there. Everything about this story is so endearing but also compelling, and I love the two protagonists. So yeah, I also have named two of my plants after the main characters, Brishan and Ildiko, so you know I like it when I name my plants after it. Last but not least on this list, however, is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. So this is another sci-fi book. It's very light sci-fi. The sci-fi element is a time travel element, a random unexplained time travel in terms of science element, which facilitates what is otherwise part historical novel, part like exploration of the relationship between a more modern time period and a historical time period. I say more modern because this book was written in the 70s or 80s, so it's also set then, which, you know, I guess you could consider historical since it's 2023. But when I am actually talking about the historical setting of this book, I'm talking about the other setting for this book, the main setting for this book, which is pre-abolition of slavery American South. And it's about a black woman who is continuously pulled back into the past, to this era where she is forced to live the life of a slave to one of her ancestors, a white ancestor in her family tree. It happens in random sporadic moments in her like contemporary modern life, and no time or little time seems to pass in the modern time, even though she can spend like weeks and months, if not years, in this historical time. And basically she's trying to figure out why she keeps getting called back to the past, why this keeps happening to her, while also navigating what it is actually like to be enslaved, and it's such an incredible novel, which I always emphasize the fact that it's not really sci-fi, even though it's got time travel in it. It's much more historical fiction, so like if you're not into like speculative sci-fi fantasy, you'll probably still get a lot from this book. Like that element of it is very like minor in terms of the storytelling and what's going on. So yeah, those are the 10 books that I'm pretty sure I recommend more often than any others, specifically adult novels as well. I didn't include poetry, short story collections, or children's books in this video, along with non-fiction, because it's just endless, isn't it? Like you've got to create lines somewhere, even if they're a bit arbitrary. But also because I think like with short stories, poetry collections, and children's novels, there are more specific circumstances under which I maybe recommend those, because not everybody reads them. Same with like comic books, graphic novels, etc. But if you are interested in those things like children's books or comic books and graphic novels, etc., let me know. I don't think I've ever actually filmed a top 10 comic books or top 10 middle grade children's books video, so I'd be interested in doing that in the future. And same goes for if you'd like to hear more about some of my like you have to read these, I keep recommending them, non-fiction books. I think with non-fiction it would definitely turn more into you have to read this. Like I think you have to read this to learn about humanity, and I think you have to read this to learn about history. Not just I love this book, but like you should read this. That's what I think will happen in a non-fiction video, but like hey ho, there you go. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you maybe got some new recommendations from it. Perhaps not, perhaps you've heard me recommend all of these before in the past, but even if you haven't checked them out, maybe this could be the push to finally do so. Let me know if you have read any of them though, would like to read any of them, or what books you just find yourself recommending over and over again, whether it's online, in person, to friends, to family, on Reddit, forums, what have you. What do you find yourself just like bringing up again and again and saying, hey, check this book out? I'd love to know. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.